Hello, good evening, and thank you for being here. Welcome to Gun Rights and Responsibilities, How to Move Forward. First of all, thank you so much to the Center of Politics for co-sponsoring this event with Converge. Converge is a bipartisan student organization that aims to tackle political polarization here on grounds. We allow students to sign up, take a short political quiz, and then we match them for a coffee or lunch with somebody who disagrees with them. We provide a discussion guide to steer the conversation towards common ground. And we believe that through humanizing conversation and understanding, we might begin to tackle some of the most intractable issues in American politics. So before I introduce our moderator, let's share a moment of silence for the 17 victims of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida. For them, I hope that we have this discussion today not as conservatives or liberals, Democrats or Republicans, but as American to American, united in our belief in the necessity of these conversations and our hope and belief that this sort of violence should never happen again. And now please join me in welcoming our moderator for the evening, Kyle Kondik. Go ahead. Mr. Kondik is the managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball, the Center for Politics' authoritative, nonpartisan newsletter on American campaigns and elections. He is a frequently cited expert on American politics who has appeared on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, PBS NewsHour, and Comedy Central's Daily Show. His book on Ohio's presidential voting history, The Bellwether, was released in June 2016. Please give a warm welcome to Kyle Kondik. And before I hand it over to Mr. Kondik, one of our co-founding members of Converge, Jenna Witterman, is going to come up and outline some of the guiding rules for this conversation that we're going to have tonight. So before you give it up for Mr. Kondik, give it up for Jenna.
Hi, everybody. So kind of to set the kind of norms of the conversation and the rules for respecting one another for this evening, I'm going to read Thomas Jefferson's advice on civility. Listen to each other's opinion in entirety. Keep an open mind. Ask for elaboration. Look for areas of agreement and disagreement. Search for questions you might ask. Identify areas of compromise. Be mindful of body language and body posture. Present criticism positively. And if you don't know, ask. Conflict is okay, and be present in the conversation. And so these are some of the principles that will not only kind of govern our conversation this evening, but also, we hope converge discussions and, many and all political discussions from here on out. So thank you so much, and I'll hand it over to Mr. Kondik.
I just want to thank Converge for participating tonight and for so many students for being here. I hope we have a good discussion. It's interesting that if you look at political science debates in the 1950s and 1960s, one of the big arguments is that our parties were too similar and that the parties crossed over too much. The public didn't really know the differences between the two parties, and so therefore we needed to have more partisanship. And just a lesson to be careful what you wish for, because we now have, I think, what a lot of those political scientists wanted. We have two parties that are very different, but we also have American politics that are really defined by a lot of rancor. And so I appreciate the Converge group for trying to bridge those gaps. Let me introduce the panel, and then we'll get into our discussion, and then we'll talk for a little bit, and we're happy to open it up for questions. Jim Todd is a former lawyer for the U.S. government. He also taught undergraduate courses in American government and constitutional law at the University of Arizona. Retired from Arizona in December 2007 and moved back to Charlottesville, where he teaches a wide range of courses for the Department of Politics and for the Usher Lifelong Learning Institute at UVA. He also is a former TA of Professor Larry Sabato, my boss. So is Kara Ong Whaley, who is a lecturer in the Department of Politics. At the heart of her research interests is a desire to understand and illuminate how the interactions of political actors and institutions structure public access and participation in policy and decision-making processes. She is also deeply interested in the causes and consequences of partisan polarization, which we were just talking about. To Kara's right is Damon Irby. Damon is my colleague at the UVA Center for Politics. He is our Director of Global Initiatives, title he's held since spring of 2009. Since the establishment of the Center's Global Perspectives on Democracy program in 2009, hundreds of delegates of all ages from around the world have participated in a variety of programs, all anchored in increasing civic engagement in their home countries. And finally, at the end of the table, Gerard Alexander, Associate Professor of Politics here at UVA. His research began with a focus on the conditions of democratic consolidation in advanced industrial countries, especially in Western Europe. His current research concerns factors affecting the size and role of government in selected cases in Western Europe, and also the United States, and how they influence conservative attempts at reform of welfare states. I wanted to start by reading the Second Amendment. I have it here in my handy University of Virginia Center for Politics pocket constitution, which we have copies of outside if you want any. And this is the Second Amendment in its entirety. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, I always thought reading it that it was just a little bit unclear what exactly the Second Amendment means, and I think throughout the course of American history, the courts have maybe had different ideas as to what it means. The public has had different ideas as to what it means. And so I wanted to start our conversation just by maybe asking each of the panelists, we could start with Jim, what do you think the Second Amendment means, and what do you think, more importantly, sort of governs how the government sort of deals with the Second Amendment?
Right. First, I want to say what a formative experience it was to TA for Larry. I came down here after having been a lawyer. I was 38 years old, and I was pushing his TV around. It really was very humbling and good for my character. Not only that, but he made fun of my home state of New Jersey constantly. So what does it mean to me? It means whatever the courts think it means, and that's one of the problems with our Constitution. And I could spend a lot of time talking to you about how we go about interpreting the Constitution. I have bad news for you in that regard, in that I have come to the conclusion, as Linda Greenhouse did when she stepped down as the New York Times reporter at the court, that the judges are basically politicians in robes. We have a situation today where the court has told us, through the Heller case first in the District of Columbia and then the McDonald case in the city of Chicago, that the Second Amendment gives us a fundamental right to keep arms. Whether it's related to militia or not doesn't matter. And that sort of resolves the question. I don't know that we'll ever go back from that decision. But the court left open the possibility that reasonable regulations could apply. And that is what we are yet to resolve in our society. And we're in the midst of discussing that right now, both in the state level and in the national level. And how that is resolved will depend partly on public pressure, but partly also on the judges who are removed from public pressure by their life terms. And sadly, there is a partisan tinge to it, in that Republican judges are more likely to to strike down restrictions on gun rights, and Democratic judges more likely to go the other way and uphold them. So what we think is a reasonable restriction is probably something we can't all agree on. But then that's what America's all about. We have discussions and debates, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I thank the Converge people particularly for their efforts, which are so valuable at this point. So.
Thanks, Kyle. I generally look at the Bill of Rights as a listing of promoting the freedoms of Americans. And in that, looking at it in that perspective, I think it's a challenge to take out one piece of that Bill of Rights and say that it's not to preserve individual freedom. So I generally view it as the Supreme Court has determined, a freedom of the individual to bear arms. But of course, I think there is that recognition that individuals don't in every single case have that right. For example, mentally ill, those who have committed heinous crimes, and so forth. But that's generally my perspective on the Second Amendment.
Well, thank you so much to Converge and to the Center for Politics for hosting this event. And I know that it's a really important and timely topic at this time. I spent a lot of the day actually thinking about this and reflecting on the Second Amendment. And one of the things I wanted to just bring up is the history of it and how it is subject to different interpretations over time. And part of that is in the language. I think it was Kyle who mentioned that you wondered what it meant, right? That there is this room for interpretation, and I think that's part of Madison's genius in forging the compromise in the Constitution. But Madison, of course, had probably some of his own thoughts, but it also went to the Senate, which was in a private discussion. So we don't know exactly every insight into what those words actually meant at the time, but we can think about the state level constitutions and what different thoughts were about what those words meant at the time and how that has evolved since. I think one thing to consider is that there were some state constitutions for example, in Virginia in 1777 that looked at gun rights as actually as a collective right? That it was about preventing and the framers of the time were very much concerned about preventing tyranny of the federal government, right? Because they were coming from the English experience. So that was one interpretation, but there were other state constitutions, like in Pennsylvania, that guaranteed an individual right, where guns were actually for protection of the individual and for use for hunting and whatnot. So we actually had these dual interpretations even from the founding about what those words meant. And I would say that we moved, the Revolutionary War really shaped the perspectives of people over gun rights culturally in the United States around the founding. But then as we moved into the Civil War, there was a reinterpretation of gun rights, and that moved much more towards individual rights in that sense. So there were, and I would also note that there were actually regulations over guns at the founding of the Constitution. There was actually a registry about who owned guns, and they also prevented, for example, African Americans who were slaves at the time from owning guns at the founding. So there has always been this idea that some may have them and others may not. During the Civil War, our notions of individual rights of gun ownership changed, and largely that was in response to the fact that African Americans at the time actually needed an individual right to protect themselves from marauding mobs or from the KKK. So in that sense, it was reinterpreted that we needed more individual rights. So I just say that to point out that, I think my perspective on this is that there are multiple interpretations of what those words mean, and in our own context, as we think about partisan polarization and also very differences in states and differences between urban and rural settings and differences in those electorates as well, we might think about those interpretations for particular needs or desires given the particular context.
Like some of my fellow panelists, I want to thank the students active in Converge and also the Center for Politics for organizing this. It's obviously timely and controversial. So thanks, Kyle, for the invitation. Thanks, too, to Converge for reading Thomas Jefferson's advice on civility out to the whole room. I was a little worried. I thought it was a bad sign when it looked like just the speakers were being warned to keep open minds and watch out for their body posture and their body language. I am not a lawyer. But I am, in my vague legal sympathies, originalist, which means in this case that I'm tempted to say that I think the Second Amendment means basically what it says, which is that government shan't not abridge individual rights to bear arms, or shall not infringe the right to bear arms. And it is worth pointing out that a shift in the legal culture in recent years has not been restricted to just conservative justices and legal thinkers on this issue. It's become significantly more pervasive than that, the understanding that this is understood as an individual right. And personally, I think that's a healthy thing because I think that's what the amendment says. And I think it's healthy to acknowledge that. And I think it's healthy, too, because it focuses attention where it belongs, which is that people who want to want to infringe the right to bear arms have to focus on the question of how they might change the Constitution. Constitutions are famously, this Constitution included, are famously difficult to change. Their sole purpose is to be not impossibly binding, but pretty damn binding. That's the only contribution, the only value they add is to be binding. On the other hand, that we know our Constitution has been changed in any number of ways, sometimes someplace and then back again, as for instance in the case of prohibition. Voting ages have been changed, lots of things have been changed, a fair number of things have been changed, and this one could be too. On the other hand, I also think, not to dispute the importance of the question and the debate that could be held over what the Second Amendment means, but if I'm going to beat one drum tonight, it's going to be to argue that I think it's a little bit moot. I think given the extent of gun ownership in America, the issue is not the amendment. The issue is the simple fact on the ground of the pervasiveness of gun ownership that makes changing its legal status just a completely separate question.
Just to add a little bit of detail to what Gerard just said. So Americans own about close to half of all the civilian-held firearms in the world. And so by some estimates, there are about 650 million civilian-held firearms in the world. And so that would mean that Americans hold about 300 million plus of all those available. And Americans also hold the most guns per capita of any country by a fairly significant amount. Additionally, obviously we have had a number of pretty horrific mass shootings in this country in recent years. I just wanted to cite some statistics from Adam Lankford, who studies mass shooting at the University of Alabama, and I'm paraphrasing him here from Newsweek from a few years ago. Lankford compiled data on mass shootings around the world between 1966 and 2012. He used the FBI's definition of mass murder, which indicates 4 or more people killed, as a threshold, with the assumption that more deadly events would have been more widely documented and therefore be easier to assemble a more complete list. With data for 171 countries, Lankford found that the United States had by far the most public mass shooters, with 90 during that 46-year period. In other words, although the U.S. accounts for less than 5% of the world's population, it had about a third of the mass shootings between 1966 and 2012. And of course, as we know from recent years, that problem has certainly not gotten better and arguably gotten worse. After the reaction to Parkland, it feels like, and others, folks on the panel can dispute this or agree with it or what have you. I generally get the sense that if you ask in polls what people think about certain gun control measures, they sometimes are generically popular, but that sometimes they're not specifically popular, and also that motivation on gun rights is sometimes concentrated in maybe people who are more supportive of gun rights. I guess I would ask the panel, do you agree with that? And also, do you think in your own observation of what happened after Parkland that maybe the public reaction is different this time? Or is it similar to past mass shootings where maybe there's some outrage for some time and then it kind of fades as a public issue?
Shall I jump in? I generally think that we today live in a nation where we have one perspective or another. And if you have a perspective that is more supportive of gun control, then your place is going to be even further established. You're going to be even more confident in your perspective. If you are from a place, or if you have a perspective that is generally more supportive of gun rights, I don't think most people are going to come around that quickly. I think many people who have a background of gun ownership, either in their family or as themselves, they're used to guns in the home. They're used to shooting, and they enjoy it. And I think I don't know if it's possible that you're going to move a significant number of those people, even with these sad and dramatic and disastrous occurrences. I don't know, maybe there will be a growing youth movement out there that really kind of starts to move the pendulum. But for that pendulum to not swing back, I think is not likely. I mean, there might be some changes on the state level, similar to Florida, but I think that ultimately there probably won't be that much change.
I wanted to respond to Professor Alexander's question about the original intent, because I'm not an originalist, so we can have a good friendly disagreement about that. I'm not sure exactly how far you go with original intent on this particular issue. When you look at why we had the Second Amendment and its placing in the Bill of Rights as the second one, after all those other fundamental ones like speech, press, and assembly, is not to be put down. That's very important that it's the second one. But I think at the time that was for the people to be able to defend themselves from an oppressive government, what they had been through with regard to their British rule. And they were fighting for their liberty. They wanted to be sure that their liberty was not going to be taken back from them. And we still see that today with people who think gun registration, for instance, would be an argument in favor. It would be something the government wants to do so they can come around, take our guns, and then take away our liberty. In the Keller and the McDonald cases, the argument was more a self-defense one. And that opens up the question of, well, which guns did the founders intend us to be able to have? And of course, the founders could not imagine the kind of firepower an individual can have today. So if you look at the two rationales, well, to keep the government from taking our liberty, certainly the more powerful guns you have, the better, if that's what you believe, and if that's what the intention is, which you can it's hard to argue against. But then when you look at the fact that only 30% of the country own guns and the number of weapons that our armed forces have and the government has, I don't see any possibility that the people with these powerful guns are going to be able to stop the government if it decides to come and take our guns away. Now, if you look at self-defense, then you get into the question of, well, how much self-defense do you need? Is a handgun enough? Do you need an assault rifle, a repeating rifle, whatever? And these are the really difficult questions we have to grapple with. And so I do agree that we need to look at original intent. I'm not sure it solves anything here, but I'm eager to talk more about that with you.
I can address that, or I can address your question. What's your
Take your pick.
What's your preference? Let me just say quickly on the matter of original intent. It's been a couple of decades since originalists focused on original intent. It's been a couple of decades that their emphasis has been entirely on original public meaning. In other words, I don't care what was in their heads because we can't know that anyway. All we can know is what they wrote and what they meant, what was meant at the time by what they wrote, the words they used. And so it's not a matter of intent, which is why the first clause of the Second Amendment I don't find particularly interesting. It's only the second one that instructs as to what the rules of the game are on this matter. Obviously, it's tempting to say that the conditions under which the Second Amendment was written have changed. On the other hand, the conditions under which the First Amendment was written has changed. And if we want to open the Pandora's box, I'm game. Are you sure you'd win on establishment of state religion in every case? Or freedom of press in every context? I'm just, they're Pandora's boxes I'm not particularly game to open. And I don't think that politics will let you open only the ones you want to open and not the one right next to it, right? On the issue of opinion on this matter, I find Damon's formulation very useful. I do think these events are tending to just harden positions on what I was joking with Kara just before we all sat down and began, has got to be, along with abortion, one of the most intractable debates in American politics, in which people just have a very strong commitment on one side or another. They're very convinced of the rightness and righteousness of their position on it. They have real difficulty getting inside the heads of people on the other side of that debate and appreciating what is good faith about it. And in some cases, I think in the cases of gun rights, even more than most, it plays well into, as an issue, as an issue of contestation in modern American politics. It really tracks nicely a lot of other debates we're having, and I don't think the abortion one does in the same way, in the sense that it's substantially about geography and demography. So let me just give a quick story in a nutshell. I a couple years ago spent a few days on the road with a guy in Montana who was working for the state chapter of a grassroots organization, an organization that wanted to develop a strong grassroots presence across the U.S. And he expressed his frustration that the organization, which had originated in New Jersey, counted his productivity and sort of evaluated how good he was as a state chapter head of that organization by how many events he held at which he did presentations and how many people attended them. And he kept telling them, That may make sense for New Jersey, which has the highest population density in the country. It makes a lot less sense for Montana, which has one of the lowest population densities in the country. How about I read a lot of op-eds for newspapers, which is how most Montanans actually have conversations, not by driving 125 miles to listen to me show them some stupid slide deck. And finally, the organization, he said, was coming around to the notion that, heaven forbid, a different rule applies to New Jersey than applies to Montana. And I think this is one of those cases, as has been alluded to by Kyle and Damon, and I'm sure is on others' minds as well, which is that, you know, to people who like to hunt and target shoot and otherwise are, you know, sports users of guns, the notion that Lakeland means that they're somehow in the wrong is a little bit mysterious. There are an astonishing number, a breathtaking number of guns in America, the monumental majority of which are never used to hurt anybody, right? Not even deer for that matter, but definitely not people. And the notion that somehow there is a sort of presumptive undesirability to all of that just because an occasional person, I think it would be the critique, misuses them, is sort of comes to them as extremely intrusive, extremely judgmental, extremely unhelpful. And this is something that I think does kind of track a perception after the 2016 election that there are two Americas, at least in part defined by geography and demography, that you know, I think this argument is just one part of. But I think it does help explain why there can be such radically different attitudes about this issue, even among Americans of good faith, you know, on public policy generally.
So I might try to get back to a little bit to the original questions that you asked, and I see it sort of on, well, but also picking up from here too, because we were talking ahead of time. I actually I spent my afternoon actually looking a little bit into some of the public opinion data on this and where there was convergence and divergence of public opinion and down partisan lines. One of the things that was actually most striking to me is that since 2000, there's been a more than 20-point shift in favor of the right for Americans to own guns. And that's a pretty dramatic shift towards a belief in an individual right. So it went from just 29% to almost 50%. People in favor of gun control actually dropped from the high 60s down to about 50%.
Just to interject real quickly, there's a lot of political science research that basically indicates that when you see that kind of dramatic change in public opinion, that's the sort of thing that politicians notice, basically. So anyway.
Right, but I would also point out to that politicians aren't necessarily always in alignment with public opinion.
True, exactly,
and they can act or not act, whether or not public opinion is with them. So
Sure.
We have lots of examples of that.
Well, that's true, yeah, absolutely.
So this is a case of who leads whom, or nobody's leading anyone at this point. And this is maybe perhaps why that Parkland may be different, right? Is because perhaps it is sparking a movement in a younger generation about the sense of what gun culture in general is in the United States, right? And that's a point that I actually want to get back to in just a second. Okay, so where is there convergence? So generally there's, as you would expect, and where there's most movement is, you know, both Republicans and Democrats broadly agree that that we should prevent the mentally ill from purchasing guns, right? Not surprising there. Broad convergence over banning gun purchases by people on watch lists or the no-fly lists. Again, not a lot of surprise there. We start to see some divergence when we look at background checks and private sales and gun shows. Although, you know, a lot of that is actually, there is no such thing really as loopholes because we have the 1968 Gun Control Act, and so a lot of that is actually already spelled out in that law. It's just a matter of, you know, how do you enforce it? But where we start to see the divergence in opinion between Republicans and Democrats is when we get to assault weapons, right? How do you, and a lot of this divergence is over, can you define it? And what does it mean when we get into some of these specifics? There's also, you know, divergence over whether or not we should create a federal database with, although majorities support creating a federal database, fewer Republicans by 30%, almost 30 percentage points support creating a federal database versus Democrats. And then huge divergences, again, over high-capacity weapons. Only 47% of Republicans support banning high-capacity weapons versus nearly 80% of Democrats. So as you, I think another really important point, I think, for this this debate that we're currently having, as we've seen the conversation shift over from can we make movement in terms of regulating which type of guns to school safety, right? That has become, I think, the prominent framing after Parkland about where we can move forward, right? And so on that point, which I think is relevant for this evening, only for in terms of allowing teachers and officials to carry weapons in K through 12 schools, only 26% of Democrats support that versus 69% of Republicans. So we see some divergence there as well. I think one thing I want to point out is Parkland different. I think there is a little bit of difference just because we're also in this never again moment or time's up and me too, right? So there's a lot, I think there's more of a little bit more momentum this time than we saw after Newton, for example. But at the same time, after Newton, I think a lot of people thought, well, this would be the moment, this would be the moment. So I don't know, we'll have to see how it plays out and whether or not these movements can keep up and keep pressure, right? Because the only way that anything will happen is if there is consistent political pressure to do something, that if the political will is created. And I'm not saying that in support of one thing over another, just to say that you have to create the political will to do something, otherwise politicians won't act, right? But I think a point that we raised, and I just want to emphasize, is that there's been a lot of emphasis on mass shootings, right? There's a lot of media attention on mass shootings, but the majority of people who die from deaths of firearms it's actually suicides, right? It's not homicides, it's actually suicides, right? And mass shootings are even a smaller proportion of those deaths, right? Not insignificant, please don't get me wrong, but we should also be thinking about the implications when we're talking about, if people have access to guns, they're more likely to commit suicide, whereas if they don't have access to a gun, there's longer time to think, there's greater possibility for intervention. And that's actually where most of the deaths are occurring, are in suicides. So we need to consider that in the debate. But I think the way that the media sensationalizes these shootings is something that we have to consider. And we also have to consider the role of our own culture and especially if we think about Hollywood or the gaming industry and how violence is epitomized and put up on a pedestal. So that we become desensitized to violence in general.
A couple of things in response to that. First, is Parkland different? I fear part of the reason it's different is because they were bright white kids. And if it had been a black school, we might not have gotten the attention. But there's more to it than that. The kids in that school all had to take courses in public speaking. And they are really good. And they even so good that they've been accused of being actors by some of the fringe people on the internet. So it's different, yet I'm not sure it's going to make any difference in the long run, because even if you go so far as to see a change as we've seen in Florida, where the legislature and the governor have put through some restrictions on guns, and this is not whether I care about whether you do this or not, I'm just trying to point out, maybe because of my bias toward law, that no matter what legislatures do, it's going to end up in the courts. And the National Rifle Association, which hasn't been brought up yet, has already filed a lawsuit in Florida against that new statute. And this means it will go to the judges. Now, do you get to a point where public opinion is so overwhelmingly in favor of some restrictions that the judges do respond to that? And that's a possibility, and it remains to be seen whether that will happen. At this point, I wouldn't want to bet on that, but let's see.
Let's talk about the NRA a little bit, because even the president recently accused one of his own party senators as being sort of in the pocket of the NRA, and then he sort of went back on that. But the NRA is often cited as sort of the roadblock to any sort of action on guns, and that particularly sometimes a lot of people, particularly on the left, will point out that, oh, well, they've donated X amount of dollars to this politician or whatnot. And I think it is probably true that the NRA it's certainly become a more explicitly kind of Republican organization. There used to be, more Democrats who would get NRA backing. Then again, there probably used to be more moderate Democrats than there are today too. What do we think about the NRA and their role in all of this?
I'll jump in. I always find it fascinating when we talk about, well, I think it kind of goes back to our original, what I spoke about a moment ago. If you have a perspective that is pro-gun control, you're going to be enraged by the NRA. That is just the way it's going to be. And if you tend to be pro-gun ownership, you're going to be probably much slower to be enraged by the NRA. I mean, ultimately, while the NRA is definitely a very controversial organization, it represents individual citizens, like in other associations or lobbyists. I mean, the NRA does not exist in and of itself. It represents people just like you. You might not believe in what the NRA believes in, but other people, a significant portion of the electorate does. And so they are going to be the villain or they're going to be the hero. And it just comes down to who you are, and that's basically it, in my opinion.
I agree, and it is an absolutely grassroots organization. It cannot be accused of being astroturfed in any way, funded by some, shadowy big donors or anything. It is a tremendously grassroots organization, and representing people who don't, engage in mass shootings, and again, don't understand why they are supposed to be paying a price for the behavior of others, and something that I think critics of the NRA should acknowledge is that the NRA is not kidding, and its supporters are not kidding when they say that they consider it a civil liberties organization. It's defending a core individual right that's, to them, not that different from rights of assembly or speech or worship. I also, and here let me sort of keep beating this little drum I warned you about, I also think that we exaggerate the importance of it. Is the NRA, as an effective lobbying and public, political interest organization, an effective barrier to legislating of certain kinds of things? Yes, it is. On the other hand, I don't think that legislation really matters very much. So I think we really do have to make a choice. We either can care a lot about passing a law that says X or Y, or we can care about trying to end what gun violence there is, the extensive gun violence there is. And those, I would submit, are not the same thing. And that part of me, I'm not a gun person myself. I don't happen to own a firearm. I don't shoot. I don't hunt. I don't really have incredibly strong feelings about this issue one way or the other. But what I do find a little bewildering is the faith of gun control advocates in the efficacy of their proposals. I must admit, I don't get it. Take, for example, in recent years, in several cases of mass shootings, where it turns out that there was law on the books that could have prevented a given incident, in the sense that somebody had access to guns who actually wasn't supposed to because they had engaged in domestic violence or other crimes, other violent criminal activity. They were supposed to have their name therefore reported to an agency that would then act on the restrictions of their gun ownership. But someone didn't bother to make that call or enter that material, their name in the database. And we can think of a number of such cases. A certain amount of the media coverage around Parkland is about the phone calls that weren't made and the following up that wasn't done. It seems to me that anyone reading about those failures of enforcement ought to have two reactions, right? The first is the very short-term and local to those events reaction of, boy, we really need to figure out how to enforce those specific laws better, right? And the second, it seems to me, is a more general reaction that people ought to have to those enforcement failures, which is it ought to erode their confidence that 51 people voting to support a bunch of words and someone else signing it doesn't cause events on the ground as comprehensive as you might like. And I must admit, I find the confidence that if only we could pass law X, this would have some sweeping effect on gun violence in America, to be a form of magical thinking, that this just somehow will have these effects. And I think the NRA does stand in the way of laws. I just don't think those laws have a lot to do with what's actually going to end up happening across the United States.
Go ahead.
Well, it's an opportunity for me to agree with my colleague, but not completely. The NRA has changed its position over the years. It was, I don't want to say moderate, but it certainly was not the extreme organization in defense of guns rights that it is today. Now, as political scientists, we should admire it for its success as a lobbying organization, because not only does it have influence in the Congress through its representation and supporting candidates with money, if you vote against them, they will run a lot of ads against you. They may even fund someone to run against you. So they've developed all sorts of clever ways to extend their influence in state and national legislatures. But going back to what Professor Alexander said, we need to change behavior to some extent, or we need to just stop having the mass media give us so much exposure to these things. The odds of a student getting shot in school are something 1 in 614 million. The odds of a student getting shot or killed on the way to or from school are higher than that. The odds of a student dying in athletic endeavors in a high school or grade school are higher than that. So maybe we've expanded, certainly, and I don't want to in any way trivialize the awfulness of seeing one of these things happen, but maybe we're overreacting to it because of the press and because of the sadness of it. And maybe we will, I don't think we're going to rush through and put in too much regulation, but there are some regulations that show that they have results that are positive. And if we can do things that will help, then I think we need to explore doing those. But there again, I'm not sure that even those regulations will withstand judicial review.
So I think the only thing I want to add on the NRA, on the issue of the NRA, is I actually assign a fantastic piece by David Davenport and Hannah Scandera of the Hoover Institute called The Secretive Scale. And it basically shows why the NRA is so effective at what it does, and that's because it's a membership organization and it provides benefits to its members, and it's representing its members. And so I think that just kind of, if you're interested in learning more about why it's effective, and to sort of emphasize Professor Alexander's point that it is, a grassroots organization, and it's an assigned reading in my political and civic engagement course. So if you don't like the NRA, then you need to mobilize and have a similar type of apparatus to represent. And they, absolutely have the right to do what they're doing, and that is guaranteed, right? It's the First Amendment, right? They're exercising a freedom of association, and freedom of speech probably as well. I think the only other thing that, just to play devil's advocate a little bit in this line of discussion, one of the things that we do know from some of the studies that have been done is that states that have more guns, so if we think about it on an XY grid, that as gun ownership increases, it tends to be the case that so also do deaths, right? So if you have more guns in circulation, there's probably going to be, it's going to increase the likelihood of conflict and of death, right? So the idea is that if you can take guns out of circulation, that therefore that would decrease the potential for violent conflict. We also know, for example, in states where there is higher gun ownership rates, police are more likely to die from shootings as well, right? Because more people have access to guns in those states. I will say though that there are two outliers in that correlation. I was talking about Hawaii, where gun ownership is much higher, but deaths from gun ownership are lower, right? So maybe there's something else going on. Maybe people are outside more enjoying things. Maybe there's a different pace of life, so that, right? And then Massachusetts, which is another one where that was the other outlier that I noticed. But Alaska, is the high end of that spectrum where you have high gun ownership rates and also higher numbers of death per capita, right? So I just thought I would add that into the mix. And then also finally to say that, when Australia was, we were talking about this a little bit before, after Australia, and just to plug, the Australian ambassador is coming. The Center for Politics is hosting him in a little bit. But when Australia faced issues and decided to institute restrictions, they had a government-sponsored mandatory buyback program to decrease circulation of guns. Again, it was a mandatory government program, and what they saw, I think I want to get this right. They saw a decrease. They saw a decrease in deaths, although they had a lower gun rate to begin with relative to the United States. So homicide deaths, I believe it was not statistically significant of a reduction, but in suicide deaths, it actually was a statistically significant reduction once those guns were taken out of circulation.
feel like we've gotten into these arguments a little bit in our conversation so far, but I feel like there's this sort of kind of predictable thing that happens on social media and in other venues after a mass shooting. And I feel like I want to sort of offer maybe a criticism of the left in general and a criticism of the right in general, and then talk about it. I think the left sometimes, and again, we've talked about this a little bit, will propose immediately some sort of gun ban, even if the specific policy proposed may not necessarily have addressed this specific incident. And I think that sometimes the right will sort of come back against the left on that particular issue, but they don't necessarily propose any solutions of their own to what is, clearly a kind of a problem that seems at least specific to the United States in terms of our high level of gun violence, at least compared to other comparable countries. There are other countries that have higher rates of gun violence, but there are also countries that aren't as stable as the United States is. And so what I ask the panel, and anybody could jump in on this if you'd like, is one, what do you think of this back and forth that we have in our public discourse after these events happen? And I guess, what do you think of how I've characterized the debate itself?
I think it's a pretty good characterization. I think it's pretty accurate. This is one of those areas in which, as you say, again, just to oversimplify, the liberals are proposing policies, conservatives are rejecting them, and they're not offering a ton in response, although periodically things are floated. So, for example, there has been a lot of movement towards asking, how do we keep guns out of the hands of people with certain kinds of mental health problems, and understandably so, because after Virginia Tech and a series of these other shootings, it's noticeable that along with the presence of one or more guns, a commonality to them was the person with relatively identifiable mental health issues. And so there has been some movement on that. There's been proposals proposed by both sides, and just after Parkland, there's been a sort of boomlet among conservatives proposing the equivalent of restraining orders for people for whom close friends or family members report predilections of violence, seeming threats of violence, which absolutely would have applied, for instance, to Mr. Cruz from the Lakeland, Parkland case. And I mean, that's a novel proposal. I mean, I hadn't heard it before. I don't know whether it's been in circulation in sort of specialist circles before, but the idea of creating a legal instrument whereby a court could go in and remove guns, at least temporarily, from the home of anyone who's been, reported again by a close friend or family member as having these manifesting violent tendencies or ambitions. But I think that part of the problem in the back and forth here is, as in so many areas, a lot of the proposals being made don't speak realistically to the problem. And let me, again, ask you to indulge me for a minute while I talk about an seemingly unrelated policy issue. There have been, for many decades, conservatives and libertarians who have wished to construe a very different state-society relationship than the ones that's existed at least since the New Deal, right? They want a vastly smaller government, especially a federal government, a vastly smaller welfare state, and so on. And I could direct you in moments to purists on this issue, sort of purist libertarians and anarcho-capitalists who sort of imagine sort of a Robert Nozick kind of world in which a great big government doesn't exist. But I can tell you from substantial experience, because I generally swim in conservative and libertarian waters, that the overwhelming number of policy engaged and informed conservatives and libertarians know perfectly well that it is one thing to have that debate in 1932 and a very, very different one to have that debate in 2016 after 80 plus years of the New Deal and the Great Society and the legacy of the institutions it created, in which you're no longer having a conversation of how purist are thou on this issue compared to me, and rather you're asking, look, if you're going to have a large and redistributionist federal government with all its array of programs like Social Security, the question is, how do you nudge them in directions that people who emphasize free markets and individual rights as individual economic rights find more palatable? And so what are their proposals? What are the proposals that actually come out of places like the Cato Institute and so many others? It's to sort of nudge a policy in a given direction to modify it in some modest way. And I think what that reveals on their part is an acceptance of a certain path dependency of these, big legacies, that when you do something for 75 or 80 years in a big way and you're not going to just overturn it, you can't have the conversation you were going to have at the get-go. You've got to have a very different conversation, and most of the movement on that conversation has got to happen got to be done by the people who've mostly lost the debate, and they've got to ask, well, what can I recuperate from a situation in which it's no longer anywhere near what I would have liked? And it seems to me liberals and progressives on this issue of guns need to engage in movement of that kind, right? The notion that if you just sort of want to pluck guns out of the hands of people is a conversation that maybe made sense 75 years ago. It does not make sense in a country with more than 300 million firearms in circulation. The notion that you're going to pass some law and that's going to just deprive the Nicholas Cruzes of this world the ability to get their hands on one or more guns, I don't understand the conversation we're having, and it seems to me there is a burden there to ask, well, we can't have that conversation. That ship has sailed. And with this number of guns in circulation, the only question is, what do we do now? What do we do in these circumstances that are so different from what we might otherwise have wanted? And that's a conversation that I don't see happening at all, frankly. I don't even know what it looks
You're
like.
not thinking about taking my Social Security, are you?
I have friends who would.
I wanted to I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to open it up to the audience to ask questions. And I kind of wanted to get it, and we've touched on this a little bit, sort of these larger cultural issues. And when I was thinking about this, I was reminded of one of the most famous quotes from the 2008 presidential election, which many of you are probably familiar with, and that was that then candidate Barack Obama, who was about to become the Democratic presidential nominee, was in a private meeting, and he was talking about small-town voters, and he had this famous quote. He says, "They get bitter, they cling to guns or religion or antipathy to people who aren't like them, or anti-immigrant sentiment or anti-trade sentiment as a way to explain their frustrations." And I was just thinking about that in relation to this debate, in that guns are maybe just a part of this larger cultural divide that we have in this country, and that if you're on the left, hostility to guns is actually hostility to a much larger way of life, and vice versa, maybe. And I just wanted to get a reaction from the panel on it. Damon, I think that's kind of the point you were making, I think, to start with.
Yeah. I would absolutely say that is the case. I mean, if you grow up in a more rural environment, regardless of your social status, you're naturally, mostly going to have a more open perspective to gun ownership. And the worldview of someone in that place is simply not going to be anywhere near similar to someone who lives in a large city, in an urban environment, simply because in that urban environment, it might not make sense for all of your neighbors to have a gun. But if you live in Montana, where there are many miles apart from people, and you do enjoy hunting or target shooting or whatever, simply owning a gun for the sake of expressing your individual freedom, I think it's going to be a challenge to bridge that gap of perspectives.
I think Damon said it very well. And I just would say that I think it's a little bit of a mischaracterization to say that's a left-right divide, right? That, that you might have, how we think of these things don't necessarily map, even though there are partisan differences, right? But our parties are shaking up a little bit right now as well, right? As we see different movements of different factions from the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and we're sort of in a little bit of a realignment, I would say, in this moment. So I just want to be careful about saying that there's a left-right divide, but more sort of point out some of these geographical or cultural or other differences and differences in worldviews that don't necessarily map neatly onto our traditional thinking of left-right divide.
Can I just follow up a little?
Sure.
It is very common in rural areas for young people, especially boys, to get their first gun when they're 12 years old. that is very, very common, and virtually, in many places, a rite of passage. And I think that's surprising to a lot of people who aren't from those areas, but it is true. And to try to bridge a gap from a family or an individual or a state, for that matter, that has that experience and worldview, to bridge that to, a resident of New York City who has never had that experience, and you just can't have a natural understanding. And that's why I think events like this are really important, because we have come together. I guarantee you there are a lot of different perspectives in this room. Probably some of the more rural perspectives, and definitely some perspectives that are abhorred by any kind of gun ownership. So anyway, that's why I think events like this are really important, so we can learn from each other and at least gain each other's perspectives.
I agree with everything that's been said. I would only add a little sarcastically, I bet, though, that there are more handguns and more small firearms in circulation in the 5 boroughs of New York than there are in the entire state of Montana. They're just all illegal.
So here's another area where I can agree, because I agree there's so many, what can we ever do to solve the problem? At the same time, my thinking has evolved considerably on this, and it's something that happens as you go through life, I think. I just no longer see any need for a human being to have a gun that shoots 100 rounds a minute. And I think that sort of thing is not protected by the Second Amendment. And if you go back to original intent, and they didn't know what we would have in terms of capability. So then you ask, well, maybe we can't figure out what their actual intent would be. So then you try to ask, well, what would they think if they were here today? And what would Madison and Jefferson have to say about, certainly they would want us to have weapons for hunting, for self-defense, but these other weapons, I'm not so sure they would be supportive of them. And I think there's room for regulation. Whether or not those regulations will be held by the courts depends partly on the ability of the country to unify and the need for it. And I know, I remember I took a group of students up to meet with Barry Goldwater years ago. He was as charming as he could be to this group of young, bright Arizona students. And then someone asked him about guns, and he said, I don't think it's a good day unless I go out in the backyard and shoot off some rounds with my Uzi. Well, I mean, that's his pleasure to do that, but is that a pleasure that's constitutionally protected or needs to be? I don't know. I'm evolving my thinking. I'm coming down more on let's allow handguns, self-defense guns, hunting rifles, but regulate the rest. Now, what happens in the future is going to depend on how much the young people in this country who've started this real attention-getting movement stay involved in it. The president and the Congress have done what they do. They've talked about things. Our president came out with some very strong statements, which he's since abandoned, but now they're talking about having a commission to look into it. Well, that's the standard way of kicking it down the road, have a commission do something about it. I hope we don't have more of these. We can do a lot of things, and a multifaceted approach is certainly the best. Education, dealing with the problem of mental health, access to guns, but we can't get any of that done without a general support that's widespread in the community. And I looked at some of the Pew Research Center statistics, and you talked about some disparity on Republicans and Democrats, but when you look at preventing the mentally ill from purchasing guns, 89% approve of that. Background checks for private sales and at gun shows, 84%. 77 versus 87 for a Republican and Democrat, but still you got 77%. Banning gun purchases by people on no-fly or watch lists, 82% of Republicans, 84% of Democrats. So I think there is room there. And again, I come back to what I keep going back to. It may be and not be upheld in the courts, but it may be if the public demand is sufficient. The court does listen to the public opinion over time.
At this time, I'd be happy to open it up to some questions. I think we have a microphone. So just go ahead and raise your hand. I'll call on you. And
Thank you. I don't know which one of you said something about the Constitution having been changed since it was written. And I think it's ironic that we here tonight on the University of Virginia grounds, the very first school shooting in America, according to the Washington Post last Sunday, was at the University of Virginia. So you're right at home. Had I stood up here in, let's say, 1840 and suggested that there was a moral case to make against slavery, virtually everyone in a room like this would have said, how can he even think that? We're all used to slavery. It is what we can't imagine a world without it. Yet a moral case was made eventually, even though a civil war was necessary to bring it into effect. I could have stood up here in 1880 and made the moral case for women having the right to vote. It would have taken another 40 years for that to happen. I wonder why today, given with 300 million guns in America, we can't make a moral case for the elimination of the Second Amendment.
Well, technically, we alluded to this a little bit, but if you did want to eliminate the Second Amendment, you would need 2/3 in Congress, 2/3 votes in the House and the Senate, and also 3/4 of the states. And part of it is, I think, a public opinion matter that whether you think the Second Amendment is good or bad or what have you, that public opinion definitely is not there at this point on that.
It's on the opposite direction.
Yeah. There was the person right next to you, I think, had a question.
I'm sorry, if I can.
Oh, go ahead.
I just
Sure,
can't
sure.
resist. One, the way you framed it had a certain history can be on our side tone to it. If your takeaway from the last year, 18 months, is that liberals and progressives, if I may stereotype for a moment, sort of own a lot of political territory in a permanent kind of way, then have at it. I just don't get it. I don't see it. I wouldn't be that confident that that's how it all works.
Well, I'm not sure the abolitionists in 1800 were very confident either of changing the nation. And I'm absolutely positive I would die long before the Second Amendment was repealed. That doesn't mean there isn't a moral case.
I just want to add that I don't see this as a liberal progressive issue as much as I see it as an American issue. And I think it's part of the problem. We've all got to figure out why we're here tonight, how we compromise and whether we can compromise on and what we can do. So.
Yeah, so I had a kind of a question for all of you guys. I really like the different points where you guys discussed kind of the perspective and how, especially Mr. Alexander talked about how somebody who likes to shoot and likes to have a gun and who's not a mass shooter, has no issues, is not a domestic abuser, can be very, very offended at the fact that, you know, somebody who's pro-gun control can see them as an inherently bad person just because, you know, whatever their culture or public opinion preferences. And I think, you know, for a lot of us, especially in my generation, the biggest question I think for everybody, how do I not get mowed down? You know, our generation is literally getting killed every day. And it's not a matter of a question of, you know, antagonizing somebody else. And I'm very sympathetic to the fact that Mr. Irby made about how people preserve their culture. Like, I'm from a place in West Africa where that's very essential to a lot of us, and some of our cultural values seem very bizarre to the rest of the world. So I'm very, very sympathetic to that. But my question is, when you talk about the regulations that are already on the ground, that are not being enforced, how do we get to a place where people on the opposite sides can agree on things that they already do agree on? That this, you know, before we bring in whatever legislation, this regulation is on the ground. How do we reinforce that? And how do we get to the point where people on the opposite sides can say, you know, I don't want to get mowed down either. I don't want to antagonize you. How do we use what we already have to see if we can fix the problem? Because I'm very sympathetic to gradual change rather than a complete revolution.
I'll jump in. I think you need to start with one thing. And maybe right now that's bump stocks. It seems like there's a lot of momentum right now for the elimination of bump stocks, because really, who needs that, right? I think most people would generally agree, not all, but most would agree that we don't need to be able to convert a semi-automatic weapon or gun that shoots when you pull the trigger to one that shoots automatically when you pull the trigger. So I think by starting with one policy at a time, then you can start to potentially make changes that could be of benefit to the country. Now, I will say regarding bump stocks, I don't know how much crime has been committed by bump stocks. I believe it was involved in the Las Vegas shooting. But otherwise, are there others that you all know of? But point being, it is a place to start in regards to working together and trying to come up with policies that both sides can potentially agree upon.
Someone in the back?
I guess, of gun regulation.
Sorry, start over.
I was saying you seem to be speaking to the potential obsoleteness of gun regulation, and I think it's more a matter of the principle than maybe the immediate effectiveness, and I'm wondering, what do you think the point of any law is? If somebody was just gonna commit a murder, why do we even have a law against it?
Because murder laws can work. I just don't see these laws having the effect that their architects think they are. Tax laws tend to work. They tend to, they result in tax payments more or less in line with their expectations, with their terms. There are lots of laws that work, but for instance, if a bunch of more libertarian-minded members of Congress, Republicans, spent the next 15 years proposing over and over again a bill to abolish Social Security, I would consider that a weird waste of their time. And so I think we can differentiate, right, between laws that are plausibly going to have some meaningful effect, that aren't just about principle, but about wanting to affect change facts on the ground, and laws that don't plausibly do that. And I just think that in this case, to talk about gun control as if there aren't 350 million guns in circulation is just not as intellectually serious as talking about gun control laws that assume that there are 350 million guns in circulation.
Do you think maybe we haven't given it enough time or effort, or actually like establishing potential regulations to give them the opportunity to fail?
Look, my colleague at the far end of the panel isn't the only one who can pull rank on age here. I am tempted to say I've seen enough of this school shooting just happened and damn it, this time it's going to be different. I've seen enough of that happen across my lifetime to not think that any one of these is going to be the decisive one. So, are there grounds to give something more time? Sure. On the other hand, this has had a chunk of time. It's been, people have run at this brick wall a number of times. And to say that this might be more about principle sort of makes me wonder if for a lot of people, it's sort of Damon's point and the one that Kyle raised or urged us to address, is it possible that this is more of a, sort of ideological statement than it is an actual attempt to change facts on the ground? And that may be. That doesn't, that is about principle, and there's something noble in that, but again, there'd be something noble, so to speak, about, libertarian members of Congress proposing to abolish Social Security, but that, I just don't think that's not what we're trying to do. Where, as a general rule, we're more pragmatic than that. We want to ask what the heck's going to actually save lives, and that's. So I'm not saying no laws do that. I'm saying laws that are pursued as if the facts aren't what they are, don't have the effects that they want to have. That's all.
Thank you.
I love that I'm the colleague at the far end of the table instead of the far left or the far right.
Right there.
This is more directed at Professor Alexander.
What have I done?
I know, I'm sorry. I don't mean to be like jumping on the bandwagon and stuff, but I've been wanting to ask if, maybe the proposals or the more liberal proposals for in terms of gun control, maybe they're not ideal for remedying this national situation, but if you're going to, what I'm trying to say is that, at least we're trying to formulate solutions, and if the right is going to, condemn the left for bringing forth solutions or bringing forth ideas that, they don't think are going to work, if you're going to criticize us, then why don't you give us a feasible solution? At least we're trying.
I would also add that I think that, and you mentioned the left and the right, I think there are a lot of people on the right who view gun crime as a symptom of deeper problems within our society. And until you get to those deeper issues, for example, broken families, I mean, really fundamental issues in our culture, the loss of fathers. I think you're not going to get at, you're going to have a hard time bridging that gap again of left and right. Many on the right, like I said, do view gun crime as, yeah, a symptom. I mean, it's a bad, awful symptom, but what are you going to do to stop the gun violence from occurring, to stop people from wanting to commit violent crimes? And I think that's where you might be a little off base in saying that the left is at least doing something. That's your perspective, but I think the left and the right look at the problem in fundamentally different ways in a lot of cases.
Hi. This is for Mr. Alexander, and it's kind of the same. Yeah. It's kind of the same as those two, but I just have to say that I'm from Newtown, Connecticut, not Newton. Sorry, I had to say that. And I babysat a kid named James Mattioli who died. And so I really just find it hard to believe to sit here and listen to you and say that even passing laws or even introducing any kinds of incentives to follow the rules that are already in place, like, why shouldn't we try? Like, you seem just very negative about it.
So notice what you've just done. You've said, look, there's this really serious problem, which there obviously is. It causes tragedies, which it does, and that this is a gun problem. But why are you so sure this is a gun problem and that this is not a mental health problem? So we outlaw things that are easier to outlaw, not the ones that we think are
Why
causing
can't it be
the problem.
both? Why can't we work on mental health and gun restrictions?
We possibly can. The question is, can we work on gun restrictions in ways that don't infringe the rights of people who are using guns in ways that don't harm anyone?
Can I also counterpoint that Adam Lanza, the one who did the Sandy Hook shooting, had a couple different mental illness issues, and him and his mom used to bond over going to the gun range, which is fine if that works for you. But then he had an AR-15 and he shot his entrance into the school. So I think it's a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
He wouldn't have been able to get in if he didn't have that type of gun.
Mm-hmm.
There's someone here up front. Go ahead, and then right here.
Okay, so my question is basically, why is gun control the answer? Because when I was thinking about the statistic that was brought up by Ms. Ong Whaley about the fact that very small percentage of gun-related deaths are actually out of mass shootings, and of course every life is significant, but with the statistics I've looked at, it can be less than 1% from year to year, and most of them are suicides. And so my question is, why is then the solution gun control? Should we not be more concerned about mental health if we're having suicides happening? I mean, there's more than one way to commit suicide, unfortunately. And it seems to me that having gun control wouldn't necessarily fix the problem, and that is fixing the general mental health of our country. And then also when you think about the fact that we're thinking about measures to restrict assault weapons, then again, that doesn't help with the effect of handguns being used in suicide. So I would just like to kind of have the panel's perspective on that particular thing, the fact that mental health could be behind most gun-related deaths.
I guess, so I think we really have to think seriously about how we address mental health in this country, but I think we also have to think about the trends towards societal atomization that have occurred as well, and how we interact with each other. So I think, for example, Converge, bringing people together, right, to talk about these issues, is a really important positive step, and we would want to see more of that, right? And the way that we engage with each other is very different right now because technology has moved so fast, right? And so I think sort of these, I think getting to your point, the point that I want to make is that there are some of these deeper issues in our society right now that we want to be thinking about. Not just necessarily gun control, and I think that's perhaps the point you were making, is how is it that we deal with conflict? Do we want to just resort to violence as the first measure, or are there things that we can be teaching in our schools so that children learn how to resolve conflict peacefully, right? And not just resort to violence. And so those are things that you can be positively working on that don't just have to do with trying to control guns, right? And so, I mean, I think one of the critiques that I have of gun control is, like, do we know that a specific policy is actually going to have its intended effect, right? I'd like to point to an example in the Northwest where environmentalists were really worried about the disappearance of owls, right? And so they stopped the logging industry. They managed a campaign to stop logging in the Northwest to conserve owls because they were becoming endangered. So 20 years later, we've assessed that policy. Well, guess what? The owls are still disappearing. Stopping logging actually didn't remedy that situation, right? And so I just say that to think about, like, there's nothing, we want to be thinking about solutions. We want to be working on it. We want to see where there are possibilities for compromise, but we need to think through, how do we define the problem? Can we even agree on what the problem is? And then we need to think through the implications of whatever we're proposing as the solution, right? And there are always unintended consequences for whatever we are doing. And we don't always know what those consequences might be, right? But let's think through some of the alternatives, like how do we address how we deal with and interact and try to re-engage each other in society, and how we deal with conflict.
Have you got any statistics on how many of the owls were shot by loggers?
Since I've already thrown myself from the frying pan, I might as well just enjoy it. I also want to point out that it's worse than, pursuing the adoption of a policy for which there isn't good evidence of efficacy, of effectiveness, also has a second cost. Not only does it not accomplish its purpose, but it's a hugely laborious thing to do, right? I mean, if the NRA proves anything, and the gun control debates prove anything, passing legislation like this that a lot of the country supports and a lot of the country opposes is an incredibly laborious, time and resource intensive thing. And if people spend 10 years finally achieving some policies that don't have much effect, have the intended effect, what have they not been spending their time on, right? What more creative, more efficacious solutions have they not been doing? So there are also opportunity costs to just trying something when it isn't the right thing.
I would like to just point out that you didn't mention anything about what policies.
Thank you for this opportunity.
I wanted to finish. Could you wait just a second? I was just responding quickly to this, that he didn't mention what policies, and that what I was talking about is policies that do have strong support, not to have strong support on both sides. It could be done quickly. That's all. Sorry.
Okay. I served 35 years for my country. I was responsible for the deaths of hundreds, perhaps even thousands of personnel in Desert Storm. I served with the 18th Airborne Corps. I found out one thing about gun policies and gun laws. They do not stop criminals or the mentally unbalanced from doing what they are going to do. The Las Vegas shooter, they looked and looked and looked for a theory as to why he did this. I say he did it because he felt like it. He was one of the cruel and evil individuals that walk among us every day. I can guarantee it. I was a corrections warden in civilian life in the Virginia prison system. Every criminal I ever spoke with never had a logical reason for why he committed gun violence. He did it because he felt like it. And that is the truth of the matter. No law that we can pass in Congress or in the Virginia Assembly can stop these people. No law. They do it because they want to. Agree? Disagree?
I think it points out the fact that we need a multifaceted approach, and that no law on itself is going to do it. And one of the things we have to be concerned with is maldistribution of wealth in the country, unequal opportunity in the country, family structure, as we heard, supervision for young people, teachers who have the support they need, and the class is small enough that they can know what's going on in the classes. So many different things can come into this. So.
We've got time for 3 more questions. There's one back there, women here up front, and then one up there. Start there. We'll go across the room.
So this is a more general question. It just refers to something I think we should address, which is like just the idea of federalism and the idea that like federal laws differ from certain state laws and some state laws are stricter. So just hearing the panel's opinions on that.
This is one of many areas in which I think federalism has something to say. Now, unfortunately, I think federalism speaks better to other practices, other things that are less mobile than guns are. My fear is that it really isn't a solution to gun problems, because a gun sold in Montana can be in Chicago within a few days. But federalism as a general rule is wise, and I think we live at a moment in American history when a lot of people should appreciate that there are others who live elsewhere in the country who might want to live under different rules than they do. And I think this is a moment for everyone to appreciate that a little bit more than they might. And mind you, this is something, gun rights and gun control issues are one in which I think there really is a dialogue of the deaf on this. A lot of liberals and progressives who are favor gun control are just not sensitive to how many rural Americans want to safely own guns. And the NRA and other gun rights activists who consider this a federal constitutional right are, they are as unfederalist about this as anybody is about anything. They don't want the gun laws in New York to be, or in Washington D.C. to be fundamentally different than they are in Montana either. This is sort of to me, a perfect dialogue of the deaf.
Sure. The United States is a vast country with very divergent perspectives, and that is clear. So I think there's a place for varying gun policies within our individual states. What works for Rhode Island probably doesn't work for Oklahoma. And there's a place for, within the individual freedom, making adjustments for access. Now, I'm not going to say what those might be, but I think there's a place for that. We're just too large of a country with too many perspectives. Really, I think it's a strength of ours. And there's a place for it.
First of all, I'd just like to thank you all for your time in speaking about this. But I'd just like to question briefly, if we can all unanimously agree that under the Second Amendment, people have a right to assault rifles, just hypothetically, what would the panel's position be on limiting, if not banning, ammunition that could be used for assault rifles? And assault rifles specifically, I don't want to touch ammunition to handguns or hunting rifles, because I think we can all agree that very specific areas need those. That type of ammunition.
I think one of the challenges you're going to find is much of the ammunition used in what are considered assault rifles is the same ammunition that is used in hunting rifles, and it's an interesting discussion, the topic of assault rifles, because fundamentally there are hunting rifles that do the same thing. They just look different, ultimately. Now, that's different to say automatic, fully automatic. That's a different story. But when it comes to a semi-automatic rifle, whether it's what one would consider an assault rifle or a hunting rifle, functionally, they're the same. So I think it would be a challenge to legislate ammunition and not impact hunting.
Yeah, so the question I had was looking sort of at the potential slippery slope argument in all of this. Like, one of the reasons many conservatives might not want to give up their guns, like just say assault rifles, which a lot of people think might be a good idea, is that what happens when somebody commits a shooting or does a crime involving a handgun? Are you going to take that too? That might be a reason why a lot of people don't want to do any sort of legislative action on this. With all due regard to Professor Alexander's arguments about whether or not legislation is good or not, assuming the population still pushes for these sorts of things, do you think there's a way to combat that sort of fear that if we give up one thing, we're going to have to give up everything?
I don't have an answer for that, but I think it's a very wise question to ask. I think one of the sort of, I've never seen this theorized in political science, but I think a very common feature of politics, not just in the US, but in a lot of places, is the tendency of people to extrapolate what the other side is advocating, and therefore to develop a kind of boogeyman image of them. And this is very mutual. Nobody has a monopoly on doing this. In which case, I think one of the shrewdest things that a political movement can do is to commit itself to going so far and no farther, and try to convince the other side that it really does not represent a sweeping threat of some kind, but really has kind of fixed goals. And I think that could be accomplished in some ways. And we make gestures to that sometimes. So, for example, every so often, when it seems particularly important, Nancy Pelosi sort of, quotes the Bible as a way of saying at a press conference, I'm not hostile to religion and religious values. It's a way to say to sort of evangelical Americans, I'm actually not here to destroy your way of life. It's, I think, one of these things, it's some very successfully done at times by some Democratic politicians in states like Montana and elsewhere who say, actually, I, support hunting and shooting sports and other kinds of things. I may feel this way about assault rifles, but that does not mean that I'm here to take away your guns. On the contrary, I own some myself. Those kinds of reassurances, I think, if done right, can be very powerful. And I think that's something that we're often not sensitive to. We don't always understand how we are perceived by the other side in a debate.
One last thing I just thought of while you're talking about that. There are a lot of things we did not get into tonight, but putting in the context of Charlottesville, what is the relationship between the right to carry weapons in public and the right to demonstrate, peacefully assemble? Can we limit, as people, individuals who want to march across our grounds with guns or assemble around the Lee statue downtown with guns? And if we uphold their right, does that show the right of people to go down, will make them afraid to demonstrate, or will they start carrying their own guns and we eventually have battles? So there's an idea for a future panel.
Well, and I think if I could just tag on to there very quickly, the Virginia Assembly in its session actually struck down bills that would have limited the right of demonstrators this coming summer to carry guns, even though they were used on both sides for intimidation last summer. So I think that's something, we're a Dillon rule state. We didn't get into that as well, but if we're talking about federalism, some states are home rule states and some rules are Dillon rule states. So our locality is being prevented from protecting the ramping up of violence this coming summer when we know that there's the possibility for that by our own state legislature as well. But, with some good reasons.
Well, but the city can deny a permit on the basis of threat of violence, and that's going to be in court, I think, may already be in court.
It is in court.
Yeah.
However, as they've already done last October, as Mr. Spencer did in last October, you can actually have assembly of 40 or less without a permit. So they can assemble in different places around the city without requiring a permit.
So that's for a future discussion. I just want to thank you all for coming and for the great questions. Sorry we didn't get to all of them. Thank our panel.